The morning didn't begin with birdsong or sunbeams. It began with dread. Even before your eyes fluttered open, your brain was already wide awake, listing catastrophes like a seasoned senator reciting grievances, a sudden peacock stampede, sour wine, guests sitting in the wrong direction of Jupiter. You hadn't even moved, and already 17 disasters were politely queuing for your attention. You lay there for a moment longer, curled beneath your linen blanket, your sleeping mat still warm beneath you. The air held that coolness unique to pre-dawn Rome, a fleeting mercy before the sun turned everything to soup. Your tunic from yesterday lay crumpled nearby, unapologetically wrinkled, much like your nerves. Then came the sound, a crisp, dry shuff against stone. A scroll shoved hurriedly beneath your door. Of course, you hadn't even touched your barley yet. You pushed yourself up, bones creaking like old cartwheels, and approached the offending object. It was already ominous. The papyrus was thick, expensive. The ribbon was pink, not red, not purple. Pink meant it was from her, the patron's wife. The last time she sent you a scroll, it was because the musicians had played the wrong version of the Bacchic hymn and someone interpreted it as a marital proposal. Chaos ensued. Pillows were thrown. Someone stormed out with only one sandal and half a fig in their mouth. You unrolled the scroll like a condemned man, unfurling his sentence. To the esteemed planner of tonight's sacred and sensuous gathering. She always started that way, as if throwing a satin glove just before a slap. Let this serve as a gentle reminder that last Saturnalia, the rose petals were yellow, not red. Guests noticed. They whispered. You closed your eyes, breathed in. Guests always whisper. That's what they do. You folded the scroll without responding. There was no point. She wouldn't read it. The scroll wasn't a message, it was a warning. Get it perfect this time. Or else. Outside, the streets of Rome were still stretching from slumber. Merchants murmured, donkeys shuffled. Somewhere, a fruit vendor shouted at no one in particular. But your day had already begun. Not with grapes or garum, but with impending doom wrapped in ribbon. You lit a small oil lamp, placed it on your desk, and began mentally sorting through the guest list. Senators, artists, philosophers, 2 courtesans, who hadn't spoken since the incident with the flamingo, and someone from the imperial family. That last detail wasn't confirmed, just rumored. It might be a distant cousin, or Jupiter forbid, Caligula. The whisper network was coy, as always. You would find out tonight, probably just before someone accidentally insults their lineage. Of course, if anything goes wrong, if the wine is too warm, or someone's peacock isn't sufficiently perfumed, you'll be blamed, not the host. You, the planner of indulgence. The quiet conductor of an orchestra, composed entirely of egos and liars. You, the man with a clipboard and no gods to protect you. You exhaled. Then you reached for your sandals and began your day like every other day, leading up to a major Roman orgy, with dread and a clipboard. Your first task of the morning was to check staffing. You had sent out runners the day before. 4 flute girls, 3 dancers, a harpist with a decent sense of rhythm, and that acrobat who could walk on his hands while balancing a tray of figs on his feet. You'd seen him do it once. He fell twice but recovered with such grace that the guests assumed it was part of the act. None had confirmed, which meant at least 2 were either drunk in the Subura or halfway to Neapolis on a philosophical whim. You made a note. Then came the food. Oysters from Baiae, still alive or at least convincingly moist. Honey-roasted dormice, plump, not stringy. Figs, dates, olives, and a selection of meats of such dubious origin you weren't sure whether to label them by province or by cautionary tale. You had requested all of it. You expected to receive half. You only needed 1 bad oyster to send Senator Gassius into a prophetic rant, and suddenly your name would be whispered with the same tone reserved for failed generals, and botched auguries, and the cushions. Oh, Jupiter, the cushions. Last time one of the couches had collapsed under a toga-heavy magistrate. He hadn't stopped talking about it since, claimed it was an omen. Tried to start a Senate inquiry. This time the couches would be sturdy. You'd make sure of it. You'd already bribed the upholsterer with a slab of imported cheese and a scandalous anecdote about his rival's sister. Roman politics had nothing on Roman interior design. You paused, inhale, exhale. You reminded yourself of who you were. Not just a planner, not just a servant. You were a maestro of madness, a cartographer of chaos. Say a man who could choreograph an orgy and still remember where the figs went. Tonight would be fine. No one would know how close it all came to disaster. Not if you could help it. You reached for a fresh scroll and began to write the day's schedule. Feather deliveries, harp tuning, wine dilution instructions, and somewhere in between, time to breathe. You stared at the wall, then laughed softly to yourself. No, not tonight. Tonight, there would be no breathing, only orchestrating, and maybe, just maybe, surviving. The scroll crackled in your hands like dry leaves, ancient and mildly judgmental. It was the updated guest list. Not that it ever stopped updating. You unrolled it slowly, like peeling back a map of unresolved drama. It wasn't a seating chart. It was a pressure diagram of Roman society, just waiting to explode over a bowl of olives. You scanned the names. Lucius Piso was attending. Of course he was. Piso attended everything. He once arrived at a funeral 2 days early just to claim the best seat. He liked to recline in the center couch, the summus locus where all eyes would fall on him, preferably with someone else's wife within whispering distance. Unfortunately, his wife, Aurelia, was also coming. She wasn't invited, but she never let that stop her. You made a note on your wax tablet. Separate couches, separate wine jugs. Absolutely. No harp solos while they're both in the room. Last time Aurelia threw a jug of garum at Piso's head. Missed. Hit a philosopher. The philosopher still insists it was a metaphor. Then there was Senator Petronius Arbiter, witty, dangerous. A man whose compliments sounded like legal threats. He could eviscerate someone with a single raised eyebrow and ruin a career with a metaphor about figs. And yes, he was attending too. You scribbled a second note. Keep Petronius far from Junius Blaccus. You still remembered the last time those two were near each other. Petronius had described Junius's poetry as a slow death written in meter and possibly contagious. Junius wept into a salad. It took weeks to get the anchovy smell out of the atrium. You continued reading. Decianus, an untrustworthy name, always accompanied by 2 additional words, and guests. Unspecified guests. Never a good sign. Could be respected clients, could be gladiators, could be a man dressed as a lion with political aspirations. You wrote, flexible seating, West End, with backup cushions and a warning system. The names blurred together after that. Some familiar, some ominous. You stopped at one line. Possible imperial presence, no name. Just the suggestion. You stared at those 2 words for a while, as if they might explain themselves. They didn't. Someone from the imperial family might attend, or might not, which meant everything had to be perfect, or at least look perfect, right up until it fell apart. This was the Roman way. You glanced out the window. Rome was now fully awake. You could hear the calls of fishmongers, the clatter of wheels over cobblestone, and a particularly aggressive goat 2 floors down. Time to finalize the entertainers. You reviewed the list. 4 flute girls, 3 dancers, and the mime twins. You sighed. The mime twins. They were dramatic, mysterious, and alarmingly flexible. One of them didn't speak at all, even off stage. The other didn't stop talking, but only in rhymed couplets. Last time they performed a silent reenactment of Romulus and Remus that ended with one guest sobbing and another proposing marriage to a curtain. Worse, Lucullus hated mimes. He found them barbaric, uncivilized. His mistress, however, adored them, and Lucullus needed his mistress's approval more than he needed dignity. You added a note. Mimes only after 3rd wine course. Keep Lucullus distracted until then. You were no longer dealing with a guest list. You were mapping rivalries, calculating distance between lovers, negotiating ceasefires between poets and politicians, all under the illusion of leisure. The orgy wasn't indulgence, it was diplomacy, and you were the exhausted, underpaid ambassador. You paused to look at the list again. Each name carried its own gravity. Each pairing had potential to delight or destroy. A Roman banquet wasn't just food and fun. It was a theater of power, a stage for ambition, and everyone was watching everyone else. One slight, one misplaced word, one sniff of underseasoned peacock, and reputations crumbled faster than a poorly baked honey cake. But there was more. The real danger wasn't even on the list. It was the person who wasn't invited, because in Rome, exclusion was louder than inclusion. To not be invited was a statement, a public insult, the social equivalent of a duel without the dignity of swords. You could already hear it. He didn't invite me. After I lent him my bath slaves, the fallout would be immediate and eternal. You stared at the parchment, then you sighed and picked up another scroll. You drew arrows, you circled names, you added warnings like, "No fermented cheese near Gaseous," and "Keep grapes away from Piso's hands after sunset." This wasn't a plan, it was a prayer, but it would have to do. You had orchestrated worse. That spring festival with the live flamingo chorus, the Saturnalia with the upside-down fountain of wine and regret. Somehow you survived. This would be no different, hopefully. You rolled the scroll tight, tied it with a ribbon, red, not pink, and handed it to your fastest runner. He darted off without a word, bare feet slapping the stones. You leaned back, cracked your neck and whispered to no one, "Jupiter, let them all be too drunk to notice." But of course they wouldn't be. Not these guests. They noticed everything. Especially the things they pretended not to notice. The guest list was stable. Not safe, not final, but stable. Like a column with a suspicious crack and a decorative vine, hiding the damage. It would hold, for now. You stood, brushed imaginary crumbs off your tunic and muttered, "Let the gods play dice, I'll just set the table." And with that, you moved on. The next disaster was waiting. The rooster crowed just once, then immediately regretted it. Somewhere in the distance it had been promptly shushed, perhaps by a baker, perhaps by a poet, or perhaps by the city itself, which knew today was not the day for early optimism. You, meanwhile, were already knee-deep in dread, reading over the entertainment roster like it was a scroll of impending calamities. Because it was. 4 flute girls, 3 dancers, 2 mimes, and 0 confirmations. You stared at the wax tablet in your hand, its surface now dotted with frantic notations and nervous indentations. It was less a guest list and more a list of potential collapses. Entertainment at a Roman orgy wasn't just a matter of music and movement. It was a symphony of egos, flirtation, and volatile theatrics that could tip into chaos with a single missed cue. You remembered last month's ordeal vividly. One of the flute girls had gotten into a philosophical argument with a harpist over whether music should imitate nature or mock it. The debate ended with a shattered instrument and a duel scheduled for the following Tuesday. Neither of them had shown up, possibly still arguing, possibly in love. Rome was like that. Today, you didn't have time for such tragedies turned romances. You needed music, movement, and just enough spectacle to distract from the questionable meat selections. You reviewed your mental checklist. The flute girls, talented, moody, perpetually late. The dancers, stunning, mysterious, suspiciously synchronized, and prone to interpretive flourishes that sometimes resulted in candles being knocked over, and then the mime twins. You sighed. Why did it always come back to the mime twins? They weren't even part of the original plan. They had simply appeared one evening during a Saturnalia rehearsal, performed an unsolicited routine about betrayal and lentils, and never left. No one had officially hired them. No one dared to unhire them. They moved through gatherings like ghosts dipped in oil, silently miming the inner turmoil of grapes or the philosophical despair of sandals. Half the guests found them riveting. The other half asked whether they were under some kind of curse. You had told them very clearly, no performing before the 3rd wine course, none. They had nodded solemnly in unison, which meant absolutely nothing. You scrawled a note, "Position mime twins near the fountain." A away from flammable objects, and Lucullus, senator, sour expression, deeply offended by theatrical silence. He once referred to mime as a cultural betrayal wrapped in tights. He also wielded considerable political influence and controlled access to the freshest oysters in Ostia. Unfortunately, his mistress adored the mime twins. Even more unfortunately, Lucullus adored his mistress. You scribbled again, schedule distraction, preferably involving harp music and compliments. Then you remembered, the harpist hadn't confirmed either. Of course, you looked to the heavens looked away. It was time for contingency plans. Rome didn't reward preparedness, but it punished the lack of it with flamboyant glee. You glanced around your modest planning chamber, really more of a glorified storage alcove, lined with scrolls, jars of ink, bolts of ribbon, and one very judgmental peacock feather in a vase. A souvenir from a previous event. A warning from the gods. You opened a scroll labeled Musical Substitutes Emergency Only. It was mostly a list of household slaves who had some vague claim to musical ability. One could hum in rhythm. Another had once played a tune on a single-string lyre to charm a goat. The goat fainted. It was unclear if from admiration. Still, you couldn't risk improvisation tonight. Not with the rumors of an imperial guest. You reached for the last parchment on your desk, the Schedule of Delights. The phrase was misleading. It was more of a tightly wound ritual of distractions, designed to keep guests just entertained enough not to notice that someone was flirting with their spouse or plotting to undermine their political career. You revised. That, adjusting the sequence, dancers during the second wine course, flute girls after the dessert of almond cakes, the mime twins, only if someone expressly requested existential confusion. A soft knock interrupted your thoughts. It was a servant, a young boy with dust on his feet and panic in his eyes. Runners. Back, he said. 2 confirmations, sort of. You blinked, sort of. The boy handed you a folded parchment, damp from sweat and slightly sticky, possibly from figs, possibly from stress. You opened it. Flute girls. Confirmed. 3 of 4. One had vanished with a senator, which meant she might show up but emotionally unavailable. Dancers. Delayed. No reason given. That meant one of 2 things, either rehearsing extra hard or caught in another interpretive feud about which sandal color best expresses divine longing. Mime twins, seen heading toward the venue, unprompted, unaccompanied. Of course they were. You closed the scroll and considered your options. Panic was one. Screaming into a jug of vinegar was another. Instead, you poured yourself a modest cup of diluted wine. Just enough to take the edge off. Not enough to make you start quoting Virgil. You leaned against the wall and let the faint hum of Rome outside fill your ears. Somewhere someone was laughing. Somewhere else someone was yelling about fish. And somewhere, perhaps within walking distance, a mime was practicing how to seduce a fig. You exhaled slowly. You were the planner, the keeper of rhythm, the unseen orchestrator of madness draped in silk. Tonight would come whether you were ready or not, and when it did, the wine would flow, the guests would gossip, and the flute girls, God's willing, would at least play in the same key. You rolled up your schedule, tied it with a ribbon, and whispered a final note to yourself. If they start miming Roman history again, I'm leaving. Let Mercury sort it out. And with that, you stepped into the next room, a place called provisioning, where even more chaos awaited, wrapped in peacock feathers and scented in regret. There is no war more delicately waged than the Roman seating arrangement. You could balance economies on bread loaves, maneuver troops through Gaul, or debate stoic ethics in the forum. But none of that would prepare you for deciding who gets to recline where at a feast, where someone once dueled over a misplaced fig. Seating at a Roman orgy wasn't about comfort, it was strategy. Reputation was measured in cushions. Your position in the triclinium, the U-shaped arrangement of 3 reclining couches, determined whether you were seen as a senator of influence, a poet of rising fame, or an unfortunate cousin who should have stayed home with his chickens. You lit a small oil lamp and cleared your workspace, spreading out a fresh wax tablet. The room was quiet, save for the occasional distant clink of amphorae being unloaded in the courtyard. You muttered aloud to yourself like a field general planning a siege. Center couch, summus locus. That's where the highest status guest reclines, technically. But two guests think they are that person. You scratched your head. Senator Lucius Piso had, by birth and bluster, always assumed he belonged there. He once sat in the center at a funeral, not even his own. But this time, the guest list included Governor Crispus, all imposing, a jawline that could open letters. And just as entitled, Piso and Crispus had been circling each other like buzzards over a fallen consul for years, unspoken rivals in politics, dinner conversation, and most recently, perfume. They could not share the central couch, not unless you fancied watching a passive-aggressive wine-splashing contest evolve into a full toga-wrapped wrestling match. You sighed and weighed your options. Piso was influential in the Senate. Crispus controlled 3 shipping routes and 1 very large gladiator. Both were dangerous. Only one would get the good wine. The other, slightly sour, aged poorly, symbolic, diplomatic vinegar. You made your choice, then quickly erased it and made another, then erased that too. Finally, you drew a small dagger beside each of their names and scribbled, "Seat at opposite ends, place bowl of olives between, use courtesans as buffer." Next, lovers, because love in Rome was never simple. It too was layered, tangled, often inconvenient, sometimes dramatic, occasionally weaponized, and tonight you had 3 confirmed couples, 2 former couples, and 1 situation involving a poet, a courtesan, and a sculpture that no one was ready to discuss. Lovers needed proximity, but not too much. Ex-lovers needed separation, but not too obvious. You placed a bowl of grapes between a pair of flirtatious senators, then a fan-bearer between 2 exes, then a local equestrian between the poet and the sculpture enthusiast. Symmetry, you whispered. Illusion of peace. There were also seat fillers. Not all guests carried intrigue or scandal. Some were simply pleasant, well-dressed, quiet, unlikely to spill garum on themselves or recite erotic poetry at the wrong moment. You assigned them carefully, like mortar between bricks, a charming but forgettable merchant between 2 rivals, a distant cousin of a noble between a courtesan and a gossip-prone widow. They would absorb tension, nod politely, and remember none of it. Gods bless them. Then you positioned the courtesans, not randomly, strategically, one near the older senators, another near the recently divorced, 2 placed deliberately near Aurelia, Piso's wife. Not to provoke, but to distract. She needed something to complain about that wasn't upholstery or wine temperature. Better the courtesans than the harpist. You leaned back and reviewed your wax masterpiece. It was not just a seating chart. It was a map of grudges, a poem of proximity, a love letter to restraint. You'd accounted for as many rivalries as you could remember, given everyone someone to talk to or avoid, and left 2 cushions empty for unpredictability. Because something would go wrong. Someone would arrive uninvited. Someone would demand to be moved. Someone would spill wine and demand a full reshuffling. The empty seats were for them. Plausible deniability, tactical flexibility, a place to exile the poet if necessary. You stared at the tablet a moment longer, then nodded. It was good, perhaps even brilliant, certainly doomed, but ready. You rolled up the plan and handed it to a runner. "Wax name tags," you said. "Seal them well and don't let anyone switch them." He nodded solemnly and vanished into the hallway. You took a breath and allowed yourself a rare moment of triumph. You had tamed the tiger of Roman seating. You had arranged the unarrangeable. You had crafted balance in a city that thrived on imbalance. Then, in the courtyard, a servant ran by shouting, "The peacock's loose." Of course it was. You stepped outside just in time to see a blur of iridescent feathers vanish behind a column. 2 attendants were chasing it with a net, one already missing a sandal. You didn't interfere. You turned and walked calmly back inside. Let them handle it. You had done your part. Let the feathers fall where they may. Provisioning is a word that sounds deceptively pleasant. It evokes images of careful preparation, of thoughtful lists, of soft cloth being laid over platters of honeyed fruits. But in reality, provisioning a Roman orgy is chaos, wearing a tunic and pretending it knows what saffron costs. You stood in the cool shade of the storeroom doorway, holding a wax tablet already smudged with stress. Your list of needs was longer than a senator's eulogy and far more dangerous. Because this wasn't just a party, this was a performance, a menu designed to seduce the senses and signal status in every mouthful. A feast that whispered, "Your host is so powerful, he fed you endangered poultry wrapped in herbs you've never heard of." You began where all Roman banquets must, wine, not just any wine. It had to be Falernian-aged, revered, expensive enough to make your patron weep and the guest swoon. You'd ordered 3 amphorae of it, then added 2 of Cuban, slightly less regal, but visually indistinguishable if poured correctly, and 1 of vinegar. That one was for late arrivals and anyone who made a scene, diplomacy again by the jug. Next, oysters, fresh, preferably alive. At the very least convincingly moist. You'd requested them from Baiae, where the sea whispered secrets and the shellfish cost more than a modest sculpture. You'd also sent a stern note to the vendor. Last time half the oysters arrived with the look of retired philosophers, grey, shriveled and ominous. One guest declared them an omen. He's still recovering emotionally. You paused and made a scribble. Bribe oyster boy with figs, then moved on. Dormice. Yes, dormice. Roasted, honeyed, rolled in poppy seeds, a staple of elite Roman indulgence, and the only rodent considered both. A snack and a compliment. You ordered 50. You would receive 35, and 5 of them would still be twitching. You adjusted the tally accordingly. Then came the meats. Roasted peacock, feathers, removed and reapplied post-cooking for dramatic flair. Sow's udder, stuffed with herbs and questionable intentions. Goose livers, because someone on the guest list insisted they were good for the soul. You added figs from Carthage, dates from Judea, and olives from anywhere but Hispania. Someone had a vendetta involving a cousin and a tax dispute. Cheeses wrapped in vine leaves, because nothing said civilized society like dairy in a toga. You glanced at the list again. It read less like a menu and more like a list of diplomatic bribes from across the empire. And yet, you weren't done. Dessert. You chewed your stylus thoughtfully. Candied almonds. Honey cakes. A pastry shaped like the Colosseum filled with live songbirds. You weren't sure how the baker would manage that, but he'd promised, and you'd promised him a night off sponge duty. Mutually assured confection. You wrote, "Do not. Let the songbirds escape during the pre-dinner speeches." Then came the perfumes. Not for guests, no, though they would be slathered in rose oil and confidence. This was for the space itself. The air had to smell like temptation, aromas layered like a senator's lies, rose oil beneath saffron water, a whisper of myrrh and just enough cinnamon to make people wonder if they were falling in love or having a sugar-induced hallucination. You scribbled, "Sent the latrines," generously. The last time you forgot, someone described the experience as a philosophical awakening in the worst possible way. You rolled up the tablet and handed it to a servant with sharp eyes and suspiciously quick handwriting. No substitutions, no improvisation. And if you forget the sugared grapes again, I'll feed you to the swans. He nodded, bowed, and disappeared. At alarming speed, you turned and exhaled. That should have been the end of it, but of course it wasn't. As you stepped into the kitchen, you were immediately assaulted by a storm of smells. Vinegar, figs, fire, and panic. The cook, a man built like a fortress with the temperament of a thundercloud, was already shouting at a trembling assistant over the dormouse stuffing ratio. Honey, poppy seeds, and if you add one more sprig of whatever that is, I'll toss you into the Tiber. You smiled. Everything was on schedule. A pig was being prepared in the corner, stuffed with birds. Yes, it was a thing. You roast the pig. Slice it open, doves fly out, guests clap, some cry. The doves generally do not return, it's tradition, and mildly traumatic for the birds. Figs were being polished, almonds candied. A jar of garum sat ominously in the back, bubbling slightly. You pointed at it. Keep that away from the bread. Last time a garum-soaked loaf turned a magistrate's birthday into a minor civil crisis. You checked the wine storage, amphorae neatly stacked, the best vintages labeled subtly. You'd learned your lesson. Never label cheap wine openly. Senators had feelings too. You nodded at the cook. He grunted back, possibly thanks, possibly a threat. Hard to tell with cooks. Outside, a breeze stirred the curtains. You paused and breathed in. The scent of roasting meat and ancient anxiety filled the air. You smiled faintly. This was Rome, this was chaos, and this was dinner. Let's clear something up right away. No, the Romans did not build special rooms to purge themselves mid-feast, just to make room for another helping of honeyed dormouse. That's a myth, a delicious, absurd, often repeated myth, but entirely untrue. The vomitorium, as it turns out, was simply the architectural name for the exit passages in Roman amphitheaters, where crowds spewed forth after the games, not their lunch. But that doesn't mean Romans weren't masters of excess. They were. And when that much indulgence met this much wine, it was best to be prepared. Quiet exits, private alcoves, strong marble basins. These were your safety nets, your secret dignity stations. Your job, as the planner of tonight's grand spectacle of silk and scandal, was to ensure that even the consequences of indulgence smelled like imported rose petals. So you started with the basics. Latrines, most guests would never mention them. Many would pretend not to use them, but use them they would. And when they did, they'd expect comfort, cleanliness, and a gentle whiff of something that said, "Even here, luxury lingers." The main latrine, just off the western garden, was already clean to a shine. Polished marble seats, lemon-scented vinegar freshly poured. Sponges on sticks lined up like little soldiers awaiting orders. You adjusted one slightly, symmetry mattered. You lit a small oil lamp near the entrance. Not for light, there was enough of that, but for ambience. A soft flicker, a flame of modesty. Then came the incense. You selected a blend of sandalwood and cinnamon, earthy, familiar, suggestive of warmth without implying food. You avoided frankincense, too sacred. Avoided lavender, too funeral. Settled on myrrh for balance. The smoke curled delicately into the air. You watched it rise, swirl, then vanish. Perfect. Outside, a servant waited with a basket of perfumed towels. He looked young, nervous, and slightly lost. You gave him a nod. 3 words, you said softly. Fold, present, retreat. He blinked. You demonstrated fold the towel in thirds. Present it with a bow, not too deep, not too stiff. Then retreat before anyone feels awkward. He nodded again. Then bowed. Too deep. Nearly dropped the basket. You gave a sympathetic smile. Better. Try again. Training a staff was like teaching birds to sing in harmony. Possible, but only just. Next, the retreat. You didn't call it a vomitorium. That word never passed your lips. But everyone knew what it was. A quiet hallway near the garden entrance. A curtain for privacy. A bronze basin. A chair angled just so. A fan bearer seated nearby, trained to hum. Soothing tunes if necessary. You inspected the room personally. The basin gleamed. The chair was sturdy. You plucked a stray grape stem from the corner. No detail too small. You added a fresh flower to the table beside the curtain. A small touch. A nod to beauty, even in moments of surrender. Then you looked up. A mural, half faded, delicately painted, depicted satyrs dancing beneath the moon. You stared at it a moment. Was it joy? Was it madness? It was Rome. As you walked back toward the main hall, the scent of rosewater reached your nose. The perfume room. A temporary apothecary. Of indulgence. Oils, salves, jars of scented wax, each arranged with almost ridiculous precision. Rose, cinnamon, saffron, even an experimental blend labeled Essence of Nile Lotus. You opened that one. Sniffed. Smelled like an expensive pond. Not tonight. You reached for the saffron oil and dabbed a drop on your wrist. The aroma bloomed, warm, golden, a whisper of confidence wrapped in mystery. You'd use this for the guest entrance. Subtle, memorable. You directed the attendants, atrium, cedarwood and citrus. Dining hall, myrrh with a touch of musk. Private garden alcoves, cinnamon and rose. Seductive, but not cloying. Every space would have a scent. Every scent a purpose, Even the kitchen would smell deliberate. Roasted fig and bay leaf drifting just far enough to whet the appetite without announcing the pig full of birds. And of course, the latrines. You returned for one final check. The lamp still flickered. The incense still danced. The towels were folded mostly correctly. You nodded once. "Well," you said aloud, to no one in particular, "if someone must purge, at least they'll do it with dignity." Back in the atrium, the air was beginning to hum, not with sound, with anticipation. You stood quietly, listening. Soft footsteps, a distant laugh, the faint rustle of togas being adjusted by nervous hands. It was almost time, and everything, from the cushions to the curtains to the perfumed privacy corners, was ready to absorb the evening's excesses with grace. That was your job, to make the chaos look effortless, to scent the unspeakable, to offer luxury, even in the latrines. By mid-morning, the house hummed like a beehive swaddled in silk. But it wasn't the guests stirring yet, not the poets, not the senators, not the flirtatious daughters of ambitious merchants. No, it was the staff. 24 humans moving in practice, silenced through marble halls and shaded courtyards, each with a task and a role and a deep, unspoken understanding. Tonight's feast was not about them, but it would collapse without them. You stood in the atrium, surrounded by 23 pairs of eyes, some sharp with awareness, some bleary with the regret of being born into a household that throws orgies at this scale. Most were slaves, some born into the home, others purchased specifically for their symmetrical posture or ability to pour wine without breaking eye contact. A few were hired performers. One was technically a musician, though that term was doing a lot of heavy lifting. You clapped once, lightly. "All right," you said. "Let's keep this simple." It never was. First, the cupbearers. You pointed to each in turn and assigned their zones. Central triclinium. Periphery lounge. West garden alcoves, you paused. Dilute the strong wine unless instructed otherwise, and I mean instructed by me, not by a senator with something to prove. They nodded. One smiled nervously. You knew his type. New, eager, terrified. You handed him a flask of vinegar labeled Falernian and said, "For the late arrivals, trust me." Next, the fan bearers, an elite group, hand-picked for their grace and timing. One strong gust, and you'd blow out a dozen candles. Too soft and a guest sweats into a silk cushion. Both scenarios ended with letters of complaint and possibly a duel. You demonstrated the ideal arc. Slow, rhythmic, almost flirtatious. Your goal is breeze, you said, not gale. A short girl with arms like vines raised her fan. "Can we rotate every half hour?" "Only if no one notices," you replied. "And if someone does, make it look like choreography." She nodded, utterly serious. You approved. Then came the fruit attendants. Yes, fruit attendants. Rome took its grapes seriously. Your instructions were as follows. Trays are to be refreshed constantly. Grapes peeled only on request. Remove any that begin to resemble raisins. This is a party, not a parable. They scribbled notes. You added, "And do not under any circumstance juggle them." One attendant flushed crimson. You didn't ask. Next, the musicians, already arguing. You separated the flute girl from the lyre player with the tired expression of someone who's prevented a dozen musical duels and expects to prevent a dozen more. Last time they had a disagreement over tempo, it turned into an impromptu duet so painfully awkward that the guests offered them marriage counseling out of pity. "No improvisation," you said, looking at them both. "We are not repeating the Bacchic fire incident." They nodded, sort of. The dancers lounged nearby, all oiled limbs and eyeliner, pretending not to listen while absolutely listening. They leaned against columns like decadent statues brought to life, exuding an aura of effortlessness that had taken 6 hours and 3 assistants to achieve. You walked through their formation. "Timing," you said softly. No early flourishes, no spontaneous monologues through movement. One of them raised a single elegant eyebrow. You raised 2. "You know what I mean," she smirked. You moved on. In the far corner, the sandal boy waited. No older than 10. Quick, quiet, sharp-eyed. His entire task tonight would be collecting discarded sandals and placing them in neat rows near the exits. You looked at him. He looked back. A silent pact. He would not fail you. Then you delivered your final speech. The one you gave every time. Not loud, not long, but carved from experience and desperation. Tonight you are invisible unless summoned, silent unless spoken to. You are grace, rhythm, precision. You paused. And if any of you spill wine on a senator's wife again, I will assign you to sponge duty until Saturnalia. They stiffened. A few swallowed audibly. One whispered, "Not again. You didn't ask." There was a beat of silence, then a collective nod, like wind shifting across a field of linen. Briefings complete. You stepped back and let them disperse like shadows. The human engine behind Roman debauchery was oiled, powdered, and aligned for now. But of course it never lasted. Just as you allowed yourself a brief moment of stillness, a messenger burst into the atrium, panting. "The musicians," he gasped. They haven't arrived." "Of course not. You pinched the bridge of your nose. I booked them 3 days ago. Flute girl, 2 Satire players, and a backup duo. They're missing." "Missing?" As in, not here. You sighed, then handed the boy a single coin and said, "Go to the Subura. Bring them back. Alive, conscious, and dressed." You turned to face the dancers. They were already protesting. "We can't rehearse without music," one of them moaned. "Then pretend," you snapped. "Or take up humming. Or start a coup. Just don't sit around like scented furniture." The poets, of course, took this moment to assume they had more stage time. You silenced them with a glare and a hand gesture you reserved for emergencies and philosophers. Somewhere in the distance, a bird cried out. Possibly prophetic. More likely, annoyed. Either way, the rehearsal would continue. The sandals would be gathered. The fans would flutter in rhythm. And the dancers, they would not set anything on fire. Not this time. Not if you could help it. The sun had barely begun its descent when the first strains of music floated through the atrium. A soft trill of the tibia, its reedy notes weaving through the air like a curious cat, followed by the gentle pluck of a lyre, tentative and searching. It was the musical equivalent of a nervous cough. You sighed in relief. The musicians had arrived late, of course, but in Rome, punctuality was a virtue reserved for funerals and tax collectors. You made your way toward the peristyle, where the performers were setting up. The flute girl, her cheeks flushed from either exertion or embarrassment, offered a sheepish smile. "Traffic," she said. You raised an eyebrow. "Goats," she added. You nodded. Goats were a valid excuse. The lyre player, a lanky youth with fingers too long for his own good, was tuning his instrument with the solemnity of a priest preparing for sacrifice. You approached him. "No improvisations," you said. He nodded, plucked a string, and winced. "Especially not in Dorian mode," you added. He looked up, surprised. You smiled. You knew your modes. With the musicians settled, you turned your attention to the mimes, or rather the absence thereof. The mime twins were nowhere to be seen. This was both comforting and alarming. Comforting, because their presence often heralded chaos. Alarming, because their absence often resulted in greater chaos. You dispatched a servant to search for them. "Check the kitchens," you instructed, "and the wine cellar, and the roof." The servant blinked. "The roof?" You nodded. "They've performed there before." He scurried off. As the afternoon wore on, guests began to arrive. They trickled in like molasses, slow, sticky, and prone to attracting flies. The atrium filled with the rustle of togas, the clink of jewelry, and the low murmur of calculated compliments. You observed from a discreet corner, noting arrivals and adjusting mental seating charts. Lucullus entered, his expression as sour as the wine you planned to serve him. He was accompanied by his mistress, who looked radiant and bored. You made a note to seat her near the musicians. Perhaps the lyre player's fingers would find a better use. The mime twins appeared just as the first course was being served. They emerged from behind a curtain, faces painted white, expressions solemn. Without a word, they began a performance depicting the life cycle of a fig. It was interpretive. Guests paused mid-bite, forks hovering in the air. Some watched with fascination, others with confusion. Lucullus looked appalled. His mistress clapped enthusiastically. You sighed. At least no one was throwing olives. Yet. The second course brought its own challenges. A platter of oysters, fresh from Baiae, was presented with great fanfare. Unfortunately, one of the oysters had other plans. As a guest attempted to pry it open, it squirted brine directly into his eye. He yelped, flailing, and knocked over a goblet of wine. The wine cascaded onto the lap of the guest beside him, who leapt up, colliding with a servant carrying a tray of dormice. The dormice scattered. Chaos ensued. You closed your eyes, breathed deeply, then opened them. The mime twins were miming the incident, exaggerated expressions and all. Lucullus was not amused. His mistress was in tears from laughter. You considered joining her. As the evening progressed, the musicians found their rhythm. The flute girl's melodies danced through the air, light and playful. The lyre player, emboldened, added flourishes that bordered on improvisation. You let it slide. The guests were entranced. Even Lucullus seemed to relax, his scowl softening into a mere frown. The mime twins, sensing the shift in mood, transitioned into a comedic routine involving invisible grapes and an imaginary chariot race. Laughter rippled through the room. You allowed yourself a small smile. Perhaps, despite the minor disasters, the evening would be a success. Then the fire started. It was small, a candle, knocked over by an overzealous gesture from a guest recounting a hunting tale. The flame caught on a curtain. A servant shrieked. Guests scrambled. The mime twins froze, then began miming panic. You grabbed a jug of wine, cheap thankfully, and doused the flame. Smoke curled into the air, mingling with the scent of roasted meats and perfume. Silence fell. Then applause, the guests interpreting. The incident as part of the entertainment cheered. Lucullus clapped. His mistress whistled. You bowed. Ever the gracious host. As the final course was served, honeyed pastries shaped like amphorae, the atmosphere was jubilant. The musicians played a lively tune. The mime twins performed a finale involving juggling invisible amphorae. Guests laughed, drank and toasted to your hospitality. You stood at the edge of the room observing. The disasters had been minor, the entertainment memorable, the guests satisfied. You exhaled, another successful evening. In Rome, that was no small feat. As the final course was cleared, and the air thickened with the combined perfume of citrus, roast fat and myrrh, you knew the most delicate phase of the evening had arrived. The guests were no longer quite themselves. Their togas loosened, their voices slower, silkier. The wine had done its job. The flutes played lazily now, no longer in pursuit of structure, just riding the mellow tide of indulgence. You nodded to a servant near the atrium to dim the lamps. Not extinguish, just soften. The mood required shadows now, not for hiding, but for suggestion. Then came the first toast. It was not from Lucullus, as you'd feared. He had fallen temporarily. Hay asleep with one hand inside a bowl of candied almonds. No, the toast came from Petronius Arbiter, whose voice was slurred, but whose diction remained infuriatingly precise. To pleasure, he said, raising his goblet. To forgetting the Senate exists, added a courtesan draped across 2 cushions and possibly 3 lovers. To the figs, said someone helpfully. You motioned for the fig bowl to be removed before the mime. Twins got any ideas? The toasts rolled on, each more nonsensical than the last. To hairless grapes, to goats with opinions, to the empire's most beautiful elbow. And yet in their ridiculousness there was joy. This was Rome at its most vulnerable. After the power, after the performance, after the posturing. Just people, wine, and silk, laughing into the night. You leaned against a column, letting yourself breathe, then she disappeared. Not a guest, a dancer, the youngest one. The one with the cinnamon oil behind her ears and the ankle bells that never chimed out of rhythm. She had been in the garden alcove only moments ago, twirling beneath the vines, casting shadows like whispers across the marble. Now she was gone. You scanned the courtyard, half expecting her to emerge from behind a column or burst forth with a dramatic spin. Nothing. You excused yourself gently from the triclinium. No alarm, just curiosity and a little dread. because dancers don't vanish in the middle of a performance, not unless something is wrong. You moved quietly through the corridors, past the vomitorium retreat, past the kitchen, where the last of the doves were being herded back into cages with more apology than efficiency. You checked the musicians' quarters, empty save for a flute case and a half-eaten fig. Then the perfuming chamber, still and sweet, with the heavy smell of roses hanging like memory. Then a whisper, not a voice, not quite, a rustle, from the eastern garden. You stepped outside. The air was cooler now, touched by the faintest promise of dawn. The fountains trickled with practiced serenity. The stars overhead were beginning to fade into soft grey, and there she was, sitting on the edge of a dry stone basin, barefoot, staring into the shadows. Her bells silent. You didn't speak right away. You knew better than to break a moment with questions. Instead, you sat beside her, waited. Eventually, she spoke. "I've danced for 6 different patrons," she said, "but this is the first time anyone lit the hallway to the latrine." You chuckled softly. She smiled, then fell quiet. Again, after a pause, you asked, "Why did you leave?" She tilted her head toward the sky. "I wasn't dancing anymore, just twirling." You understood. There's a moment in every performance when the soul leaves the body, and when it doesn't return, the dance turns hollow. She stood, brushing dust from her hem. "Do you think they noticed?" she asked. You shook your head. "Not yet. But if they do, I'll say you were receiving a prophecy from Bacchus himself." She laughed, a sound like silver brushing silk. Then, without a word, she stepped back through the garden archway and into the house. You followed moments later, and by the time you returned to the main hall, she was already dancing again. This time slower, dreamier, more woman than shadow. Guests watched, entranced, and no one asked where she'd been, because some mysteries belong to the night. And in Rome, mystery was half the charm. You made one final pass through the atrium. The goblets were low, the laughter softer now, tinged with sleep. The harpist was playing something delicate, something that reminded you of fog and morning and regret in equal parts. You nodded to a servant. "Begin winding down." The wine diluted, the torches lowered, the flutes quiet. One last toast rose, softer than the others. "To those who made this night beautiful," said someone you couldn't quite see. A few raised their glasses in your direction without looking at you directly. That was the highest compliment, to be acknowledged in passing, not as a presence, but as a result. You bowed, slightly, then stepped back into the shadows. The dancer, the flute girl, the poet asleep on the citrus-scented cushion, all of it was fading into the gentle blur of a night well managed. You smiled. Tomorrow, they would forget your name, but not the evening. And that was exactly how you liked it. The embers of the evening glowed softly as the final courses were cleared, and the guests reclined deeper into their cushions, lulled by the warmth of wine and the gentle melodies of the lyre. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats, sweet pastries, and the lingering perfume of exotic flowers. You moved quietly through the peristyle, ensuring that every detail remained in its place. The musicians played a soothing tune, their fingers dancing over strings and pipes with practiced ease. The dancers, adorned in flowing silks, swayed gracefully, their movements a visual lullaby for the weary revelers. In the corner, a group of senators engaged in hushed conversation, their laughter subdued but genuine. Nearby, a poet recited verses to an attentive audience, his words weaving tales of love and heroism that seemed to float on the evening breeze. Suddenly, a commotion arose near the entrance. A servant, breathless and wide-eyed, approached you with urgency. "Master, there's been an incident in the kitchen," he whispered. You excused yourself and followed him swiftly. Upon entering the kitchen, the cause of the disturbance became clear. A small fire had broken out near the hearth, likely sparked by an errant ember. The cooks had managed to contain it, but not before a tray of figs had been charred beyond recognition. You sighed, both in relief and exasperation. The figs had been intended for the final toast, a symbolic gesture to honor the abundance of the evening. Without them, the ritual would feel incomplete. Thinking quickly, you instructed a servant to retrieve a fresh batch from the storeroom. As he hurried off, you turned to the head cook. "Ensure the fire is fully extinguished and the area cleaned," you said firmly. "We can't afford any more surprises tonight." Returning to the atrium, you found the guests beginning to stir, sensing the approach of the evening's conclusion. The musicians transitioned to a more uplifting melody, signaling the impending final toast. With the replacement figs now arranged on a silver platter, you nodded to the steward, who began distributing them among the guests. Each person received a single fig, a symbol of prosperity and gratitude. Raising your own fig, you addressed the assembly. "My friends," you began, "tonight we have shared laughter, stories, and the finest offerings of our land. Let this fig represent the sweetness of our fellowship and the hope for many more gatherings to come." The guests echoed your sentiment, raising their figs in unison before taking a bite. The room filled with murmurs of appreciation and contentment. The evening drew to a close. The dancers performed one final routine, a slow, mesmerizing piece that captivated all in attendance. Their movements told a story of unity and celebration, a fitting end to a night of indulgence and camaraderie. With the last notes of music fading into the night, the guests began to depart, offering their thanks and farewells. You stood at the entrance, bidding each one goodbye with a warm smile and a promise of future gatherings. Once the final guest had gone, you returned to the now quiet atrium. The remnants of the evening lay scattered, empty goblets, half-eaten, delicacies and the faint scent of incense lingering in the air. You took a moment to reflect, allowing yourself a rare moment of pride. Despite the minor mishaps, a small fire, a near miss with the figs, the evening had been a success. The guests had been entertained, the food and drink had flowed freely, and the spirit of celebration had prevailed. As you turned to retire for the night, a soft rustling caught your attention. One of the dancers stood in the shadows, her expression contemplative. "Is everything all right?" you asked gently. She stepped forward, offering a small smile. "Yes," she replied. "I just wanted to thank you for tonight. It was beautiful." You nodded, touched by her sincerity. "Thank you," you said. "Your performance added grace and elegance to the evening." With a final nod, she disappeared into the darkness, leaving you alone once more. You looked around the atrium, now bathed in the soft glow of the remaining oil lamps. The night had been long but fulfilling. As you made your way to your quarters, you couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation for the next gathering, the next opportunity to create something memorable. For in Rome, the feast was never truly over. It merely awaited its next beginning. Dawn crept into the atrium on silent feet, casting long golden fingers across the mosaic floor. The oil lamps, once vibrant with life, now flickered their final breaths, their wicks curling like the tired dancers who had swayed beneath them. Hours before, you stood at the threshold, a silent observer to the aftermath of indulgence. The air was thick with the remnants of perfume and roasted meats, mingling with the faintest hint of smoke from the extinguished fire. The feast had ended, but its echoes lingered. Servants moved with practiced grace, collecting goblets abandoned, mid-toast and rearranging cushions that bore the imprints of reclining guests. The musicians' instruments lay silent, their strings still vibrating with the memory of melodies played. In the corner, a poet stirred from his slumber, his scrolls scattered like fallen leaves. He blinked against the morning light, muttered a line of verse and promptly fell back asleep. You smiled. The banquet had been a success. The kitchen buzzed with activity as the staff prepared for the day's simpler meals. The head cook, her hair hastily pinned, directed the cleaning of platters and the salvaging of leftovers. A tray of honeyed dates, untouched during the festivities, was repurposed for the servants' breakfast. You entered, nodding in appreciation at their efficiency. "Any casualties?" you inquired. "Only pride," she replied with a chuckle, "and perhaps a few egos bruised by the dancers' indifference." You laughed, the sound echoing off the stone walls. In the garden, the dew-kissed leaves shimmered under the rising sun. The fountains murmured their eternal song, a soothing counterpoint to the revelry that had transpired. Birds chirped hesitantly, As if unsure whether the celebration had truly concluded, you wandered the paths, noting the trampled petals and overturned goblets. A sandal, its strap broken, lay forgotten beneath a laurel bush. You picked it up, contemplating its owner and the journey that had led it here. A rustle drew your attention to a figure seated on a bench, her gaze distant. It was the youngest dancer, her ankle bells silent. "Couldn't sleep?" you asked gently. She shook her head. "Too many dreams, too much music still playing in my mind." You sat beside her, the silence between you comfortable. "Do you ever feel," she began, "that the night steals a part of you, leaving you incomplete come morning?" You considered her words. "Perhaps," you replied, "but maybe it also leaves behind something new, a memory, a feeling, a story to tell." She smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling. "Then I suppose I'm richer for it." Back inside, the mime twins were engaged in a silent argument over a misplaced prop. Their exaggerated gestures and contorted expressions turned the dispute into an impromptu performance, drawing laughter from the nearby staff. You intervened, separating them with a raised eyebrow and a pointed finger. "Save it for the stage," you admonished, though your tone lacked severity. They bowed in unison, retreating with theatrical flair. As the sun climbed higher, guests began to stir. One by one, they emerged from their chambers, their appearances varying from refreshed to disheveled. Greetings were exchanged, some warm, others tinged with the awkwardness of shared secrets and overindulgence. Lucullus appeared, his toga impeccably arranged, betraying no sign of the previous night's excesses. He approached you, a rare smile, gracing his features. "A memorable evening," he declared. "Your attention to detail is commendable." You inclined your head. "I'm pleased it met your expectations." He nodded, then leaned in conspiratorially. "Though I must admit, the fig incident was a stroke of genius. The guests will be talking about it for weeks." You blinked, momentarily puzzled, before recalling the charred figs salvaged from the kitchen fire. "Indeed," you agreed, choosing not to elaborate. By midday, the villa had returned to its usual rhythm. The remnants of the feast were cleared, the decorations dismantled, and the staff resumed their regular duties. The echoes of laughter and music faded, replaced by the mundane sounds of daily life. You retreated to your study, the quiet a welcome contrast to the previous night's cacophony. Unrolling a scroll, you began to draft notes for the next gathering, ideas already forming in your mind. A knock interrupted your thoughts. The steward entered, holding a small parcel. "A gift from one of the guests," he explained, placing it on your desk. You unwrapped it carefully, revealing a delicate figurine, a dancer mid-spin, her form captured in graceful motion. A note accompanied it. "To the orchestrator of dreams, thank you for the memories." You smiled, placing the figurine on a shelf among other tokens of appreciation, another story added to your collection. As evening approached, the villa settled into tranquility. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of amber and rose. The first stars appeared, twinkling like distant candles. You stood on the balcony, the cool breeze carrying the faint scent of jasmine. Below, the garden whispered its secrets, the leaves rustling in gentle conversation. The feast was over, but its spirit lingered, in the laughter that still echoed in the halls, in the memories etched into the walls, in the hearts of those who had shared in its magic. You closed your eyes, breathing in the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories, but for now, you allowed yourself a moment of peace, a moment to savor the afterglow of a night well lived. By the time the sun began its slow descent behind the terracotta rooftops, the air in the courtyard shimmered with heat and tension. Everything, as always, was nearly in place. The couches had been dusted and fanned, the garlands had been laid in artful spirals, and the incense was being tested at various strategic points. And then a commotion, a sharp yell, the unmistakable clatter of a wooden cart, and the hasty arrival of 4 musicians from the east gate. They were supposed to have come through the atrium. They were supposed to have arrived an hour ago. They were supposed to look divine. Instead, they looked like they had been dragged through 7 layers of the underworld. One limped, Another had only one sandal. A third held his flute in a way that suggested it might double as a weapon if provoked. The fourth, the youngest, had figs stuffed into every available fold of his tunic. "What happened?" I asked, trying to keep my tone balanced between concern and fury. "Bandits," said the limping one, "or at least very aggressive merchants. They wanted a toll. We offered music. They wanted figs. We negotiated." I pinched the bridge of my nose. "So naturally you arrive half-dressed, limping, and with fruit where your dignity should be. Better figs than bruises," the youngest muttered. Primus appeared silently beside me and handed one of the musicians a spare sandal from the emergency wardrobe. Yes, we had one, because experience had taught me that Roman evenings could be dangerous. "Care Fairs, can you still play?" I asked. The oldest nodded. "We may not look ready, but we are. Give us a moment and a fig each and we shall transform." I wasn't sure whether to be impressed or horrified, but I gave the order: figs, wine, and a cool room to tune in. Flaccus escorted them, his expression one of cautious optimism. Meanwhile, I had Minia check the soundscapes. Our backup lyrist was present, mildly tuneless but enthusiastic, and the percussionist had not yet set fire to anything, which was a good start. The central challenge of this part of the evening was transition, the moment where background ambience became performance, when murmured conversation was overtaken by melody, and when every guest decided whether they would listen, talk over the music, or try to seduce the nearest body within reach. The musicians returned cleaner, dressed in borrowed silks and wearing expressions of mild panic. The flutes gleamed. The fig stuffer even had a flower behind one ear. I gave a subtle nod. They began with a lilting tune from the east, soft, winding, like smoke rising from a censer. It caught in the folds of the drapery and tangled with the scent of sandalwood and citrus. Heads turned. Conversation softened. Even Aurelia paused in her tirade about decorative amphorae. And then, as if fates had conspired in our favor, the sandal broke. A clear snap, a wobble, and the flautist, the fig stuffer, caught himself mid-fall by latching onto a nearby pillar. The music did not stop. A miracle. I exhaled. Primus, standing near the pillar, reached out and handed the flautist a small decorative cushion, which he quickly slid under the arch of his bare foot. The music resumed without pause. The guests chuckled softly. It became a moment, a shared one, warm, human, and oddly charming. Aurelia gave me a look that said, "I saw that and I approve." The rest of the performance was, well, it was flexible. The group adapted. They shifted their formations, rebalanced themselves around the hobbled flautist, and at one point even incorporated the wobble into the rhythm. Laughter rang out. It was all planned, I assured anyone who asked. During a brief break, I approached them again. "How did you do that?" The oldest shrugged. "In Antioch, we once played a whole wedding while knee-deep in fish. This is nothing." I made a note to hire them again, perhaps not for a funeral, but certainly for a wedding, or another feast with Lady Aurelia, which was, to be honest, a form of both. Their second set began. This time, they were joined by the lyrist who, despite his unfortunate tendency to miss notes, added a texture that soothed the ear. One song blended into another, an ode to Bacchus, a lament of a river nymph, a playful mimicry of merchant calls in the forum, and through it all the figs remained. The musicians swore they were for good luck or energy or to ward off evil. I didn't care. If figs were what it took to keep them playing this well, I'd commission a statue of a fig. When the last note trailed off and the applause swelled like the sea, I allowed myself a rare smile. The guests were entertained. No fire had been set. No parrot had cursed, and the flutes had held steady. Flutes, figs, and flexibility. A good title for a memoir, perhaps, or a warning to anyone who thought Roman parties were ever simple. The importance of pillows cannot be overstated. They are not mere comforts, not simple decoration. In the right or wrong arrangement, they are declarations of power, intent, alliance, and flirtation. And tonight, they were my most delicate. Battlefield Lady Aurelia, ever the empress of theatrical ambience, had dictated a theme of layered abundance. Pillows, she said, should cascade like the Tiber after spring rains. She wanted them in purples deep as emperor's dreams, greens like young olives, and golds that whispered of treasuries and secrets. Each couch had its designation. Each color, a coded message. Purple, prestige. Sit here only if your name appears on marble. Green, flirtation, meant for those who might enjoy company more than conversation. Gold, warning, approach with caution or excellent wine. Naturally, everyone wanted purple, and naturally most did not deserve it. I began the layout with the confidence of a seasoned general. The triclinium was mapped, marked, and slowly blanketed in plush stratagems. My aides carried piles of imported Egyptian cotton, dyed and scented, and arranged them in socially calculated trios. Lucius Piso, as bombastic as a street preacher, had to sit close to Aurelia, but not so close that she could slap him. They were, after all, married. Their domestic affections involved decanters, harsh words, and the occasional flying olive. Aurelia, resplendent in burgundy silk, had selected a central dais. Around her would be the influential, the amusing, and at least one poet whose charm might divert her from more flammable impulses. I placed Petronius Arbiter diagonally, close enough to observe and quip, far enough to avoid entanglements. He enjoyed observational power, not physical proximity. Place me within range of wine and scandal, he'd once said. I need not choose a favorite. Junius Blaccus required a place with acoustic advantage, lest his poetry be drowned in laughter. Yet I could not place him near the harpist again. Their feud over lyrical authenticity still simmered. Then came the special guests. The emperor's cousin, unnamed, ever shrouded, was to be offered a throne of velvet and discretion, 3 pillows, none matching. Why? Because nothing unsettles Rome's elite more than asymmetry. Each placement meant political resonance. Seating. Piso beside a lesser senator could be read as insult. Letting a poet lounge beside a general might spark a duel, or worse, a collaborative ode. One had to think 3 social moves ahead. Minia hovered beside me, holding a parchment list and an expression of wary reverence. The green pillows are running low, she whispered. Divert some from the east alcove. That one's mostly ornamental and houses the chronically uninteresting. And the leopard-patterned ones. Only for the visiting Gauls. They enjoy excess and misinterpretation. A slave approached with a crisis. One of the golden pillows had a wine stain. I examined it. No, that's a deliberate dye gradient. Let it stand. It looks expensive. We progressed couch by couch. Some adjustments required diplomacy, others bribery. Piso's manservant slipped me a coin to adjust his master's seating slightly closer to the musicians. He's working on a new oration about rhythm, the man said. I nodded solemnly. No one wanted that oration performed cold. An hour passed, then 2. The space began to breathe. Gold caught the fading light. Purple nestled into shadows. The greens seemed to pulse with mischief. A map of alliances, grudges, and lusts. I stepped back, surveying the battlefield of velvet. Primus approached, carrying a tray of sample wines and his usual stoic silence. He raised one brow. I understood. Yes, it looks like a lounge for gods and monsters, I replied. The guests began to arrive. The placement became reality. Petronius glided to his corner with a smirk. Ah, the satire seat, he murmured. Perfect. Piso flopped onto his assigned space and immediately began quoting Livy. Aurelia rolled her eyes but said nothing. Progress, Blaccus circled, clearly unhappy with his station. The acoustics here favor gossip, not grandeur. That's intentional, I muttered. And then the cousin, hooded, quiet, drifting in like mist. They sat precisely where I'd intended. Asymmetrical pillows, curious glances, no complaint. I let out a breath I hadn't known I'd held. A guest, tipsy already, tumbled onto a couch too lush for his rank. I watched as a servant redirected him gently toward a more appropriate patch of upholstery. Subtle corrections. That was the dance music swelled. The harpist found his key, candles flickered. The politics of pillows had held. Later that night, when the wine had flowed and the revelry began to blur, I saw two guests trade places, their cushions incompatible. One now sat on flirtation, the other on danger. By morning, they would not. Remember, but I would, and the pillows ever silent never forgot. To understand a Roman feast, one must understand that the kitchen is less a place of cooking and more a battlefield of culinary ambition, near religious superstition, and barely restrained chaos. Tonight, it had become a war zone. The air vibrated with heat, smoke, and threats issued in 3 dialects of Latin and a few words of what I assumed to be Punic. The head cook, Sextus, a man whose tunic had not seen cleanliness since the reign of Claudius, barked orders like a centurion on his last nerve. His forehead glistened with sweat, oil, and possibly garum. His apron bore the marks of previous meals, an abstract history of sauces, meats, and emotional breakdowns. Who skinned? This dormouse like a barbarian, he roared, waving a small naked rodent above his head like a grim flag. I asked for elegance, not mutilation. The offending slave, wide-eyed, tried to melt into the shadows. He failed. Sextus hurled the dormouse into a bowl and turned to the next catastrophe. We are low on imported saffron, bellowed another cook. Then use domestic and lie creatively, Sextus snapped. Tell them it's a Phoenician strain, call it temple grade. Nearby, a young assistant attempted to sculpt fish mousse into the shape of Neptune. The result resembled a startled goat. I redirected him to the honeyed dates. In one corner, a massive roast boar was being slowly glazed with a mixture of honey, vinegar, and spices. Its mouth was stuffed with apples, its eyes replaced with pearls. It looked faintly insulted, as if aware of its fate and unimpressed by the effort. Minia entered behind me, a scarf wrapped around her nose. Smells like ambition and panic in here. You should see the pastry station, I said. They're trying to suspend figs in a latticework of spun sugar. One sneeze and the entire structure could collapse. Indeed, the dessert team was attempting feats better suited to architects. A sugar tower shaped like the Capitoline Hill trembled with every footfall. Beneath it, a young boy whispered prayers to household gods as he held a stabilizing rod. Any word on the flaming peacocks? I asked. Minia grimaced. They are here. They are angry. The handler says they hate cinnamon. Of course they do, I muttered. Why wouldn't they? The peacocks were not meant to be literally aflame, mind you. It was an illusion. Fine wires, bits of reflective foil, carefully timed bursts of scented oil on flame. But even illusions, I had learned, could scorch an eyebrow or a senator. Sextus cornered me near the fig-glazed quail. We're short too, amphorae of pomegranate syrup, and someone swapped the pine nuts with amphorae labeled for bath use only. Are they poisonous? No, just mildly so. Use them on the lower nobility's side of the table, he laughed. I did not. I made rounds. The stew station had resolved its earlier incident with the goat meat and the missing bay leaves. The head baker was calm, mostly, because he had stuffed his ears with olive bread to avoid hearing Sextus. Then came a real emergency. The sauce has separated, screamed a small, panicked voice. I followed it to find a young girl pointing at a bowl of now-clotted garum reduction. Remake it, I said. It took 4 hours. Then use vinegar and honey and call it old style. They'll never know. Crisis managed, I allowed myself a glance at the prep tables. Flamingo legs dusted with rose petal salt. Snail shells filled with sweet cheese and dates. Minced ostrich patties with mint. It was excessive. It was absurd. It was perfect. Outside, the triclinium was nearly full. The musicians played softly, the wine flowed. But the real show, the engine that powered the illusion, was here, in the steaming, fragrant, frenzied belly of the house. I watched as Sextus leaned over a simmering cauldron, muttering to himself like a priest consulting omens. I approached. What's this one? An experiment, he said. Wild mushroom broth mulled with fig sap and anchovy oil. Will it kill anyone? He paused. No. Probably. That was good enough. By now trays were being lifted. Platters were hoisted onto strong shoulders. Stewards moved with choreographed grace, carrying delicacies as though they were temple offerings. Remember, I told the lead server, left side, For presentation, right side for removal. Smile. Make eye contact only with those who are clothed. He nodded with grim determination. As the first dish passed into the dining hall, I exhaled. The madness would continue for hours. Dishes would be swapped, disasters avoided, accidents barely dodged. But the illusion was intact. Backstage, Sextus raised a ladle in mock salute. To the gods of madness and digestion, I raised an amphora. May they never compare notes. While the kitchen waged its glorious war against time, flames, and fig-related misfortunes, another quieter form of strategy unfolded in the eastern corridor of the villa. Here, tucked behind the mosaic of Venus and the dolphins, was the scent chamber. Most Roman homes have a tablinum, a room for scrolls and records. I have a room for perfumes, and today it smelled like a garden at war with a spice merchant. Minia, who fancied herself a Narcissus, a nose with legs, was deep in meditation, sniffing 3 amphorae arranged like oracles. Each held a blend meant not to be noticed consciously, but to be remembered like a dream. Elusive, mysterious, and mildly arousing. This one, she said, holding a wooden strip under my nose, is sandalwood and cardamom, layered with dried citrus peels and a hint of ambergris. I inhaled. It smelled like a wealthy senator's regret. Smoky, warm, faintly fishy, too brooding, I said. This is an orgy, not a funeral, she tried again. Jasmine with clove and basil oil wakes the senses. Too lively. We're not rousing a legion. Lavender and rose with a pine resin base. Now we're closer, I said, eyes closed. Add a touch of orange blossom, something soft and sunlit. She adjusted the ratios like an alchemist measuring time. The scent drifted upward and bloomed slowly in the space. It lingered without clinging, whispered without shouting. This was the balance. It had to make the guests feel enveloped, not assaulted. It had to encourage secrets, not declarations. We called it Midnight Garden. It was, in fact, blended in the afternoon. I ordered the servants to begin placing scent burners in key positions, near the draped entrances, beneath the frescoes, along the edges of the triclinium. Not too many, just enough that when someone entered, they wondered if it was the flowers or the furniture that sighed. The perfumes extended beyond the air. We dabbed oil onto the cushions, discreetly. Pillow politics included scent layering. Flirtation pillows received a touch of rose and nutmeg. Prestige pillows smelled faintly of cedar and frankincense. Even the goblets were anointed, a drop inside each rim, just before the wine was poured. It was said that scent and taste traveled together, and if the guests felt intoxicated before the first sip, well, that was simply good hosting. Is this manipulative? Minia asked, watching. Kerr's servant gently sent a senator's cup. Absolutely, I said. So is architecture, so is poetry. There was, of course, danger. Overdo it, and the scent became a character itself. A brash, oily guest who never left and gave everyone headaches. I still remembered the infamous musk disaster of last spring, when a merchant convinced Aurelia to trial his new blend, which had been so potent that several guests fled to the garden coughing. One claimed to see visions of Mars in the smoke. Another claimed to have lost all memory of Latin. Never again. We also had to prepare for olfactory counterattacks. Certain guests, particularly the wealthy but tasteless, had a habit of arriving drenched in personal perfumes, heavy, syrupy things that clashed with dignity. The senator who smells like apricot wine and onions? Minia asked. Blackus, I confirmed. Intercept him. Offer a ceremonial cloak spritzed with our blend. Call it a tradition. We also offered scented hand rinses at the entrance, a bowl of water infused with lemon and myrtle leaves, symbolic cleanliness, a touch of luxury, and a way to mask whatever provincial oils they might bring. And then, of course, there were the flamingos. They were nesting by the fountain, beautiful, irritated, and subtly fragrant. Their handler had rubbed their legs with a mixture of rose oil and fennel to calm them. It worked surprisingly well. The birds preened. One attempted to mate with a statue of Apollo. Another stole a grape from a senator's plate, but they smelled divine. As the sun dipped and torches were lit, the scents came alive. Heat unlocked the deeper notes. Pine drifted under citrus. The sweet, spicy breath of rose clung to silks. The atrium glowed, and glowed warmly. Guests entered and slowed. They breathed deeply. Some tilted their heads, trying to identify what was happening. Most simply smiled. Perfume was the invisible host. It greeted without speaking, welcomed without touching. It softened the mood and made every guest feel slightly more intriguing than they were. Aurelia passed me in the hall. The air tonight smells like someone who remembers your name. Well done, Minia beamed. I exhaled. The battles of meat and cushions were fierce, but the war of perfume, we won it silently. There is a strange silence before a Roman feast, the sort of hush that feels borrowed from temples and battlefields. The villa at this precise hour is poised. Everything, every silken cushion, every polished goblet, every strategically placed grape is not just in place, but vibrating with potential. The torches flicker, as if whispering of things to come. And in that moment, I begin my final walkthrough. Minia walks beside me, clutching the planning scroll with a charcoal stub and a brow furrowed in priestly concentration. We have rehearsed this for weeks, but now the performance must be divine. We begin at the gate, where the hired doorman lounges with calculated indifference in bronze-threaded linen. His nod is practiced, just respectful enough to hint at exclusivity, just bored enough to suggest he's seen better gods than you. The approach to the villa is a gentle path of rose petals and imported pine needles, meant to trigger olfactory nostalgia. Torches line the path like loyal sentries. Statues of minor deities have been turned ever so slightly to ensure favorable glances upon entry. Minia adjusts the tilt of a marble satyr. He was ogling the column, she mutters. Now he ogles the guests. In the atrium, the music is beginning. The flute trio murmurs a melody meant to sound as if someone is remembering a dream. The harpist, finally in tune, plucks notes like dewdrops. The couches are arranged in what we call the triangle of temptation, an open configuration that encourages flirtation, not fistfights. A drapery sags in the corner. I frown. That curtain is drooping like a defeated senator. Minia climbs a stool and tightens the cord until the folds resemble victory banners. Behind it, Neptune in the fresco offers a more approving smirk. We move into the triclinium, the heart of indulgence. The low marble tables are groaning under the weight of edible art. Sugared violets, roast boar with gold-flaked tusks, honey-glazed birds reassembled into improbable poses. I realign a pyramid of dates that's begun to slump under its own ambition. The wine amphorae stand in military formation, dustless, gleaming, strategically positioned so the server appears to float rather than reach. The shirtless pourers line up by height and handsomeness, as Aurelia ordered. They shine faintly from a dab of olive oil on the shoulders, a touch that suggests both service and seduction. Outside, the peristyle garden is part Eden, part theatre. Vines are wound like bracelets around columns. Fountains murmur like confidants. Flamingos strut, or rather they preen and doze in equal measure. One nestled in a fruit bowl opens one eye as I approach. We should move the melon, I say. Noted, Minia replies, scribbling. Melon relocation, urgent. The scent burners are already at work, carefully spaced to create gentle waves of fragrance. Too much at once, and a senator might faint. Too little, and the illusion shatters. Walk through clouds of citrus, pine, and something faintly mythological. Now comes the briefing. The staff assembles in the shadowed corridor like gladiators awaiting the signal. Primus, my stoic second, stands arms crossed, radiating calm menace. I look into their faces, these servants, actors, shadows. You are not seen, you are felt. Like the breeze in a tapestry, the hand that catches the falling goblet. Tonight we are gods, and gods do not trip. There are nods. Some nervous, one burp, quickly stifled. I pace before them like a general. If someone begins to sing, listen. If someone begins to scream, interrupt. If someone begins to strip, offer a warmer robe. We are the keepers of calm, the curators of chaos. I turn to Primus. Inventory check. Backup scroll in place. Extra figs sliced. antacid infused wine ready, just in case. And the distraction. Contingency? He taps his belt. A small wind-up cymbal monkey, courtesy of a Syrian magician, a diversion. Should someone grow dangerously bored or political. Satisfied, I sweep through the final hallway. The frescoes glow in torchlight. The tiles are polished to deceptive slickness. The couches whisper promises of decadence and orthopedic regret. Back in the atrium, the first strains of formal music begin. Guests will arrive soon, carrying with them perfume, gossip, and poorly hidden ambitions. Minia reappears. The guest with the parrot has sent word. He is bringing all three. Wives, I close my eyes. Add 2 more pillows and a large bowl of unsalted nuts. The parrot likes to snack. The breeze picks up. Or perhaps it is the collective exhale of a house that knows it must impress. A knock, distant, then closer. A rhythm, not unlike a heartbeat. Minia places a hand on my shoulder. They're here, I nod. Let the curtain rise, the doors open. The first guest to cross the threshold was not, as I had half dreaded and half expected, a jaded patrician bearing whispered scandals, but Corvinus, the most extravagantly dressed merchant this side of the Alps. He arrived like a thunderclap, in silk. His tunic glinted like coinage in a treasury fire, and his sandals looked more suited to temple statuary than human feet. Where shall I hang my leopard cloak? He bellowed to the startled doorman, his voice bouncing off the marble like a runaway chariot. On your humility, I murmured, mostly to myself. Following him like an imperial procession came his 3 wives, each one a walking contradiction of Roman virtue. The first, Tacita, wore a smile soft as honey and immediately asked whether the floral arrangements were inspired by Elysium. The second, Livia, eyed the floor mosaics with suspicion, muttering about symbolic geometry. The third, Callisto, beelined toward the wine table and asked whether any amphorae had been blessed by Bacchus himself. And then came the parrot. Bright as a senator's ambition and twice as vulgar, the creature emerged from beneath Corvinus's cloak like a badly kept secret. Its feathers shimmered, its eyes gleamed with calculated mischief, and its first contribution to the evening was to shout, "Orgy!" at maximum volume, startling a flamingo into a nearby bowl of olives. Minia appeared at my elbow, already scribbling. Relocate the nut bowls to the western colonnade, I instructed, and tell the musicians to double tempo. We've entered the phase of the evening where birds get vocal. Noted, she said. Also, the parrot seems to have memorized someone's shopping list. It just requested 6 honeyed locusts and a foot massage. More guests spilled in, each one more colorful, bewildering, and meticulously perfumed than the last. Petronius Arbiter glided into the atrium with the grace of someone who expected to be quoted tomorrow. Behind him, a scribe tottered with a scroll so long it brushed the mosaic floor. I'm here to record wit, the scribe explained breathlessly. Then, you're already behind, Petronius quipped, and winked at a marble statue. Next came Junius Blaccus, clutching an unfurled scroll and reciting verses even before he crossed the threshold. A tired-looking eunuch followed him, nodding at each line as though trying to coax meaning out of ancient stone. Behind them loomed Lucius Piso, who had apparently mistaken "bring a guest" to mean "bring a marble bust of Socrates." He cradled the stone head like an infant. He speaks wisdom through silence, Piso declared. Then perhaps we should all take after him, I said. Aurelia descended the central staircase like an empress of drama and expensive fabric. Her gown shimmered with gold threading, her hair held up by pins shaped like dolphins and daggers. Her eyes scanned the room, her expression somewhere between admiration and threat. Why is the parrot seated? She asked. It insisted, I replied. She nodded. I like its confidence. The last to arrive, or rather, to appear, was the Emperor's cousin. Hooded, silent, trailed by 2 guards who looked carved rather than born. They moved without sound, gliding into the space as if passing through a dream. No one approached. Everyone noticed. The feast began. In the atrium, laughter bloomed. Goblets clinked like flirtations. The harpist struck a surprisingly bold chord, and someone near the fig tower gasped in pleasure or confusion. The musicians had found their rhythm, so had the guests. I weaved among them like smoke. I adjusted a sagging cushion, redirected a particularly chatty senator to the poetry corner, and intervened when the flamingo attempted to peck at the ankle of a legate's wife. Primus appeared. The flamingo tried to eat a musician. Did it succeed? No. Then it's simply engaging with the arts. In the peristyle garden, quieter conversations unfolded. Affairs began or continued. A minor priest swore he saw Venus in the vines. Someone mistook an olive for a gemstone. There was a small debate over the authenticity of the anchovy paste. At the food tables, the dishes received applause. The roast, boar, glistening and sinister, was declared surprisingly philosophical by one guest, who claimed its snout resembled the late consul Brutus. Petronius and Blacchus hovered at opposite ends of the atrium, like storm clouds made of silk. Petronius dropped biting witticisms like crumbs, and Blacchus returned fire with increasingly impassioned verse. The Parrot offered commentary, sometimes rhyming, often profane. "More figs, Lucius," it shrieked. "The gods are watching." Lucius, caught mid-gesture, blushed and dropped the fig. The room spun with sound, scent, and spectacle. Wine flowed like gossip. Gossips flowed like wine. It was, if I may say so, beautiful. And for one brief, fleeting moment, the chaos held its breath and became art. Every Roman feast has a turning point, a moment so delicate that even the gods, if they attended, would hold their breath. It is not when the first goblet spills, nor when someone misquotes Virgil with gusto. It is that sliver of time when conversation grows both louder and less coherent, when laughter begins to echo off marble too rhythmically, and when every eye seems to glisten, not just from wine, but from possibility. This is the prelude to what I call controlled chaos and navigating. It is an art. One cannot halt it, nor can one flee it. It must be shaped, sculpted, coaxed like a wild creature that has wandered into the atrium and might at any moment bite a senator. The musicians are always the first to feel it. I see them glance at one another, brows tightening, fingers pausing mid-strum. I nod. That's their cue. They slide seamlessly from structured harmonies to unpredictable strains. Melodies from the east, ghost notes and scales that shimmer like incense in torchlight. Petronius lifts his goblet, takes a sip, and with the flair of a man born to command, attention declares, "Tonight we shall see who among us is art and who is merely furniture." It is the evening spark. Clusters form. Conversations shift. The atrium blooms with performance. Senators cluster around Lady Aurelia, who has taken up a dramatic pose on a silk-laden couch and is recounting an incident involving a missing falcon, a shipment of cinnamon and a mistakenly summoned augur. Her laughter is a siren call. Everyone laughs. Even those who don't understand the story laugh, because not laughing would mark them. Lucius Piso is in the midst of orchestrating a philosophical debate on the ethics of olive consumption. His argument, already circular, becomes spiral. His third wife, one sandal off, throws a grape at him and shouts, "You're confusing Epicurus with your uncle." The parrot from its perch squawks epistemology, and then proceeds to laugh at its own joke. In the peristyle garden, which has taken on the feel of a moonlit theatre, couples melt behind pillars. A nobleman performs a surprisingly elegant, interpretive dance with a flute girl. A retired general uses 2 throw pillows and a breadstick to reenact the siege of Alesia. The flamingos, sensing the shift in energy, begin a synchronized prance around the central fountain. They are magnificent, and mildly threatening. I remain calm. Primus appears at my side. "A wine jug has shattered," he says. "Cause?" A guest attempted a dramatic reading of the Aeneid and punctuated his verses with wide gestures. "Send. Menia." She knows how to soothe a bruised ego and mop wine at the same time. Also, the harpist is improvising. Dangerous. He's in E-flat, possibly F-sharp. Let him finish the song. Then bribe him with candied almonds to play softer. Meanwhile, Junius Blacchus is deep in discourse with a foreign envoy, offering a 22-stanza poem on the metaphysical symbolism of fig trees. The envoy nods with the look of a man who does not understand the language, but fears being impolite. A senator climbs atop a low couch and begins to sing. His voice is surprisingly clear, though the lyrics are suspect. A noblewoman, possibly his cousin, claps along. Another guest swears the statue of Apollo is winking. This is my moment. Distractions like safety valves must now be released. If not, the room may combust in a burst of spontaneous oration or interpretive mime. I give the signal. The dancers enter, not like performers, but like breeze given shape. Their movements are fluid, veiled, mesmerizing. They drift through the chaos like calming agents. Their rhythm guides conversations back into tolerable cadences. Then comes the food parade. It is absurd. It is perfect. Servers emerge with towering dishes, trout sculpted into battle formations, a roasted peacock nestled on a throne of asparagus, a pie from which scented steam escapes like a minor miracle. Guests gasp. Applause breaks out. Even the flamingos pause as if admiring the plating. Control for a moment returns, but it is fragile. Someone dares a friend to race around the garden naked. A senator debates whether the roses are edible. A poet is composing on the back of a wine-stained napkin. Still, the illusion holds. The music deepens, becomes sultry. The air is thick with myrrh and secrets. A man claims he just received a prophecy from the moon. Another confesses to falling in love with a lyrist. No one is sure who is sober, and no one cares. Minia approaches. Should we release the mimes? Not yet, I say. Mimes, like curses, are best saved for dire need. We step back. The guests shimmer in lamplight, moving as if enchanted. Laughter, whispers, and the occasional splash from the fountain fill the night. In this hour, chaos is not a threat. It is art. And tonight, I am the artist. If there is a single truth that binds all Roman feasts together, from the humble countryside gatherings to the glittering madness that tonight aspires to, it is this. Sooner or later, someone demands a performance. And it is always, invariably, either a mime or a senator. Sometimes, horrifyingly, it's both. Tonight it was both. And it began, of all things, with a sausage. Not just any sausage, mind you. This one was an import from Gaul, hand-coiled, seasoned with fennel, rosemary, and the sort of red wine that philosophers write love letters to. It was paraded into the triclinium on a silver platter, its skin glistening like freshly oiled marble. The crowd leaned in. A poet from Thessaly murmured that the curve of its casing reminded him of his homeland's rivers. Then came the mime twins. I had fought to exclude them, fought like a cornered senator accused of embezzling amphorae. Their last performance had involved fire, feathers, and a misunderstood segment about domestic plumbing. But Aurelia, intoxicated by both nostalgia and wine, had insisted. They're improved, she said. They took a sabbatical in Cyprus. They studied restraint. Nothing about their entrance suggested restraint. They slithered into the atrium. In silence, faces painted with absurd tragedy. Lips drawn wide in false sorrow. Eyebrows arched toward the heavens. The guests murmured. The parrot said, "Oh no," with a tone of genuine dread. The music dimmed. The air tensed. Their act began as a mime retelling of Rome's founding myths. Romulus and Remus, the she-wolf, a deeply committed mime Tiber that involved one twin rolling across the mosaic in increasingly damp-looking motions. It was surprisingly poignant. Then came the turn. The first mime mimed sausage preparation. Grinding, mixing, stuffing the imaginary casing with exaggerated sensuality. The second mime gazed upon the invisible sausage with such aching tenderness, one could almost hear harp strings. They enacted an entire courtship, a romance built on silence and encased meat. Reactions varied. Petronius laughed into his goblet. Blackus made a face as if forced to smell undercooked squid. One guest from Crete asked if it was a commentary on imperial overreach. Then, just as the mime sausage love story reached its dramatic apex, the parrot screeched, "Eat it!" A real sausage, hurled from somewhere near the musicians, sailed through the air. It struck a senator's goblet, splashing wine onto a matron's embroidered stola. She shrieked, then retaliated by flinging a pomegranate at the offending table, and that was all it took. Laughter exploded. A serving tray went down. A small bowl of olives was upended and rolled like marbles across the marble floor. The mimes, ever opportunists, incorporated the chaos into their performance. One caught the throne, sausage mid-air, and mimed it as a gift from Jupiter. The other enacted being slain by its glory. It was absurd. It was brilliant. Even Aurelia, perched among satin and scandal, clapped. She turned to me and said, "If this ends with someone climbing the fountain, I want it immortalized in fresco." Minia appeared at my side. "A guest is proposing to a serving girl using a fig and a toothpick. Is she accepting? She's counter-offering with a honey cake. Then let it be a fair union." More sausages were passed, not thrown, thankfully. The musicians resumed their duties, now improvising a playful dance tune that looped and dipped like a tipsy dolphin. Conversations, though skewed, resumed. The twins took a bow, a real one, synchronized and slow. The applause was enthusiastic, though it may have owed as much to wine as to appreciation. I caught a glimpse of Primus, standing at the edge of the atrium, arms folded, eyes scanning. He gave me the faintest nod. We were still in control. Barely. The sausage platter, once centerpiece, was now diminished, its glory devoured by those still laughing. One senator was attempting to balance a sliver of sausage on his nose. The Parrot offered a commentary in verse. I looked around. The lamps glowed warmly. Perfume still floated in gentle clouds. Laughter echoed with genuine delight. And no one, not even the gods, could have predicted that tonight's high art would involve mime, meat, and metaphor. The mimes vanished into the shadows of the garden. The chaos receded like a satisfied tide, and I exhaled. The mimes had performed. The sausage had soared, and the feast against all odds continued to hold. There are many ways to measure the unraveling of a Roman banquet. Some prefer to count the number of empty amphorae. Others tally the disrobed garments, and some, like myself, track it by music, and nothing signals the beginning of the feasts. Descent into theatrical absurdity, more than the harpist losing his key. At first it was subtle, a gentle discord during a rendition of The Lament of Daphne. But then, without warning, he shifted into what can only be described as a spirited improvisation in a mode not known to any school of Roman music, or perhaps even human comprehension. The harp strings moaned like confused nymphs. The melody twisted like a snake having a nightmare. The effect on the guests was instantaneous. One woman dropped a fig tart and gasped. A senator lifted his head, wide-eyed, and said, "Is that Greek?" Someone else murmured, "No, worse, Etruscan jazz." The harpist, unfazed, continued his solo, swaying with the rhythm only he could hear. His fingers moved like those of a man possessed, by Bacchus, or perhaps by a mischievous kitchen spirit with no musical taste. He smiled serenely, as if he alone could hear the celestial harmony within the chaos. I tried to intervene, but Aurelia stopped me. "Let him finish," she said, eyes twinkling. "He's either mad or brilliant, either way it's memorable." And memorable it was. In the far corner, a group of guests began imitating the harpist's off-key stylings with wine goblets and breadsticks. They formed an impromptu percussion section, beating rhythms against amphorae, their own knees, and the occasional guest's back. Then came the olives. It began innocently enough. Someone dropped a bowl. The olives rolled across the marble floor like marbles with a mission, but rather than panic, a guest cried, "Game!" and began trying to stomp them mid-roll. Others joined in. It became a sport. Who could crush the post olives in a minute? Minia appeared beside me, chewing the end of her stylus. "Should I stop them?" she asked. "Only if the olives revolt," I replied. The game escalated. One man attempted a dramatic slide across the atrium to squish a particularly elusive calamata. He succeeded, but lost his toga in the process. Applause followed. Someone. I yelled, 10 points, and tossed him a fig as a prize. Meanwhile, the harpist, apparently emboldened by the chaos, transitioned into a composition he called The Fall of Carthage, which sounded like a cat arguing with a thunderstorm. And yet the guests were entranced. Even Petronius, usually disdainful of anything outside iambic pentameter, tapped a sandal in time. "Unexpected," he murmured. "I may write about this. A ballad of olives and musical ruin." In the garden, the flamingos began to respond. Perhaps it was the vibration. Perhaps they too had opinions on harmony. Either way, they began strutting in rhythm. One guest proclaimed, "It's a sacred procession," the parrot agreed. "March, march, olive war," it screeched. A nearby senator offered it a grape in admiration. Aurelia, now seated with a grapevine, crown placed, likely by herself, on her head, gestured regally and declared the olive stompers priests of Dionysus. The crowd cheered. Someone began to chant. And so in the space of 15 minutes the feast had become a festival, the atrium a temple, and the harpist a prophet of dissonance. Primus appeared, ever the rock in a river of chaos. One guest has slipped on an olive. Minor bruises. Another claims she heard Apollo in the harp. Could be worse, I said. Let's mark this as peak energy. From here, it's downhill or divine. More olives spilled. A guest built a miniature colosseum from crushed pips. The harpist, sweating now, launched into what could only be described as his hymn to a troubled goat. It included notes I'm fairly certain only existed in theory. The tension reached a crescendo. Then, like all storms, the music softened. The harpist paused. Silence fell. Guests froze in the echo of his final, unresolvable chord. Aurelia stood. "You, sir," she said to the harpist, "are either a genius or a danger to the Republic." He bowed. "Perhaps both." Applause thundered. Wine refilled. The olive squishers collapsed onto cushions, victorious. The flamingos returned to their perch. The parrot demanded fruit. And I, watching from the shadows of the peristyle, allowed myself one small, exhausted laugh. The music had broken. The olives had scattered. The gods had perhaps winced, but the feast was alive. It started as most regrettable moments do with a fig. Someone, no one will admit who, lobbed a particularly ripe one across the triclinium. It struck a senator's turban and burst like a soft drumbeat. The senator, mistaking it for insult, rather than fruit, responded with equal maturity and hurled a grape in return. From there, escalation was not a choice, but a law of physics. Figs flew with remarkable precision. One arched beautifully through the air and landed in a goblet of wine. Another struck a scribe's scroll, leaving a stain that might now be mistaken for punctuation. The parrot, ever the opportunist, joined in with cries of "Duck! Aim! Victory!" Aurelia watched from her cushioned throne, amused. "Let them exhaust themselves," she said, plucking a fig from her own platter and squeezing it gently. "Art requires release." And so it went, a slow-motion war of soft missiles. Cushions were overturned for cover. Toga folds were weaponized as slings. One man attempted diplomacy, holding up a fig like a white flag, only to be hit by 3 in the face. Petronius naturally wrote about it as it happened. "Ode to a flying fruit," he mumbled, scribbling in wine-soaked ink. Verse 1, plumage of pulp, precision of chaos. Then Junius Blaccus, who had spent the last half hour in meditative silence, stood abruptly. "This is disgraceful," he announced. "We are not Gauls, we are Romans, civilized, poetic." A fig struck him in the shoulder. He did not flinch. Instead, he unrolled a scroll and cleared his throat. "To restore decorum, I shall recite, 'On the eternal flame of virtue.'" The crowd groaned. One guest visibly wept. But Blaccus pressed on. The first stanza was dry as sand and twice as long. Petronius, who had reached his limit somewhere, around the line "perennial integrity of civic spirit," stood and interrupted. "Enough. Poetry should evoke joy, not dental work." Blaccus stiffened. "Would you prefer your poetry served with olives and slapstick? If it suits the meal, why not?" A murmur of anticipation swept the guests. Even the flamingos turned their heads. Aurelia clapped. "A duel, then. Petronius versus Blaccus, verse for verse. Winner gets the golden fig." A servant held up the gilded fruit, freshly polished. The harpist, still trembling from his earlier triumph, struck a minor chord. Petronius bowed. "My first offering to a lopsided vase at dawn." It was witty, sharp, full of metaphors that made the parrot cackle. Blaccus countered with a meditation on stoic endurance that referenced 12 extinct philosophers and 3 legal codes. It was, in short, excruciating. Round 2, Petronius offered a satire on toga fashion. Blackest responded with a lament about moral decay, using meter so irregular it required explanation. Round 3, Petronius improvised a verse on Aurelia's jewelry that made her blush and the parrot whistle. Blackest attempted a rebuttal with a sonnet on civic duty, but halfway through, someone threw a fig, not at him, to him. A vote. More figs flew, now gently, now joyfully, toward Petronius. Aurelia rose. By unanimous pelt, I declare Petronius the victor. Cheers. Applause. A brief chant of verse, verse, verse broke out. Blackest, to his credit, bowed and returned to his seat with as much dignity as one could muster with fig pulp in one's hair. Petronius accepted the golden fig, raised it like a trophy and promptly handed it to the parrot. Poetry, he said, should feed the soul, or the bird. Laughter erupted. Even the flamingos seemed to bob approvingly, and I, watching from the edges, felt a flicker of peace. For one rare moment, chaos had structured itself into ritual. Art had arisen not from silence or order, but from fruit, noise, and fragile. Egos, this I thought is Rome, and this is why I planned the orgies. As midnight draped its velvet shawl across the domes and columns of the city, a hush descended that was not silence but a shimmering between heartbeats. The feast had crested its grandest swell. Platters lay half-eaten. Goblets clinked with less urgency. Laughter, once a fountain, now trickled into softer, breathier rivulets, a collective exhale scented with wine, figs, and jasmine. And in that gentle fall, the orgy began. It was not announced. There were no gongs, no declarations, no sudden shedding of garments en masse. Rather, it bloomed like dusk, natural, enveloping, inevitable. One pair drifted behind curtains. Another followed. Cushions shifted, silks rustled, limbs rearranged. No one gave instructions, yet everyone knew. Aurelia had planned for this like a tactician, preparing for both battle and ballet. Her servants had laid out silken throws in shaded alcoves and stashed pitchers of cool water behind columns. Candles were positioned to cast light without revealing too much. The air was thick with myrrh and sandalwood. Trays of pomegranate seeds and honeyed almonds lined the peripheries for energy or post-coital diplomacy. I moved among them, not as participant, but as guardian, ensuring pillows remained fluffed, that servants replaced melted wax, that the flamingos, so far, did not attempt to join. They had shown an unhealthy interest in bare ankles earlier. The guests moved slowly now, their voices low. Gone were the debates, the recitals, the shouting of misremembered lore. What remained was murmured poetry, unspoken invitation, and the rustle of linen falling to marble, and then came the oracle. He had been quiet most of the evening, a slim man in deep violet, eyes ringed with kohl, wrists stacked with bronze bands. No one knew his name. That's often how these oracles appear. Anonymous, soft-spoken, slightly glowing. He rose without ceremony, stepped barefoot onto a low table and raised his hands. Friends of Rome, he intoned. The spirits have spoken. I have seen visions among the olives and the oil. All turned. Even the parrot blinked. The Tiber will flow backward. Saturn will dance again, and Rome will be ruled by a red-haired woman whose laugh brings rain. A noblewoman gasped. A merchant dropped his date. One man laughed nervously and offered a coin, but the oracle ignored all and knelt beside a wine spill. With one finger he traced circles in it. Here is the wheel of fate, he said, voice lilting. Here is where you fall in love. Here is where you forget why. Someone passed him a fig. He took it reverently, held it high, and whispered, "Wisdom in flesh." The parrot, roused by ceremony, shrieked, "Fig for Rome, glory, glory!" Petronius, never one to resist drama, stood and declared, "Let the fig speak." He held up a golden fig, cradled like a relic. "What say you, O fruit most divine?" He bit it. There was silence. He chewed thoughtfully, then said, "Tart, decisive. The Republic is doomed." Laughter rippled like a breeze through silk. Even Blackus, lips stained from pomegranate, chuckled. The oracle sat again. "You mock," he said softly. "But the gods do not." Aurelia raised her goblet. "Then let us toast them, and their very peculiar sense of timing." More visions emerged. One guest claimed to see Neptune's beard in a fig smear. Another insisted the arrangement of olives in her bowl matched the star map of Jupiter. A senator tried to interpret the folds of his own toga and ended up in a knot. Minia whispered that someone was reading omens from wine drips on thighs. I sighed. That had happened before. Yet the mood remained strangely reverent. There was no mockery now. Even in jest, something sacred clung to the air. Touches lingered. Eyes searched. The orgy continued, yes. But now under the gaze of fate, fiction and fermented revelation, I leaned against a column and watched. I had seen many such nights, where bodies blurred and laughter became indistinct, but never had prophecy and pleasure entwined so fully. This was no longer merely a feast. It was a dream Rome had about itself. Lurid, longing, infinite, and as torches. Burned low and the moon climbed toward its final arc. The oracle whispered once more. One of you will wake tomorrow changed. He did not say who or how. No one asked. At last dawn yawned over the rooftops of Rome. Not with the triumphant blaze of conquest, but with a pale, indecisive glow. More suggestion than sunrise. The oil lamps still flickered, their scents faint and smoky. Somewhere in the garden, a flute gave a final sigh, the last breath of a song unfinished. Inside the villa, silence had begun to stretch its limbs. The orgy had settled, not ended. Bodies dozed in languid tangles, entwined like vines left unpruned. A senator lay slumped in a cushion pit, his toga acting more as blanket than garment. Someone's sandal was perched upon a bust of Minerva, and the flamingos, blessedly calm, stood in contemplative stillness around the main fountain. I walked slowly through the peristyle garden, my feet soft against the dew-chilled tiles. This was always my favorite hour. Not the revelry, not the peak of laughter or prophecy, but this, the unraveling, the after-image of chaos. Minia found me first, bleary-eyed but alert, her scroll in hand. Preliminary count, she murmured. 2 shattered goblets, 1 cracked column pedestal, and 1 decorative urn occupied. I blinked. Occupied. She pointed to the atrium. There it stood, a Greco-Egyptian urn once intended to hold flower arrangements or overly ambitious wine displays. Tonight, however, it held a man, specifically a junior diplomat from Carthage, his limbs folded like poorly arranged scrolls, his head resting atop what looked suspiciously like a fig-stuffed pillow. He got in himself, Minia assured me. Well, I said, at least he's off the floor. As we tiptoed past, the parrot gave a hoarse croak from its perch beside the main couch. More figs, it murmured, then sneezed. The remnants of the feast lay in elegant disarray. A half-bitten honey cake here, a trail of olive pits leading to a cushion fought there. The harpist had curled up beneath his own instrument, one string, still humming in the breeze like a ghostly encore. Aurelia emerged from behind a curtain, her gown wrinkled but her hair impossibly perfect. "Is it morning or merely later in the night?" she asked. "It is the grey between regrets and breakfast," I replied. She smiled. "Then pour me something bitter and start counting the survivors." We made our rounds. Most were accounted, for a few had vanished, likely into other villas, other beds, or myth. One particularly pale guest had written something on the wall with berry juice. Jupiter was here. Someone had added, "And he owes me a tunic." Primus appeared, looking remarkably unrumpled. "Kitchen is intact, only one ladle missing. Probably used as a weapon. Probably deserved it," I said. "Anyone in need of mending?" He gestured toward a distant couch. A minor poet was being gently sponged by 2 slaves. Bruised pride, verses unappreciated. In the courtyard, the sun finally cleared the neighbor's rooftop, casting golden light across the discarded fans and wine-stained scrolls. For a moment, it all looked like the aftermath of a battle, a soft, perfumed, whispered war. Someone stirred in the decorative urn. "Am I in Elysium?" he asked. "No," I said gently. "You're in Aurelia's atrium. Be grateful it's not the other way around." The urn groaned. The musicians, slowly awakening, began to tune themselves. Not their instruments, those had long since given up, but their voices, their roles, their memories. One flute girl asked if last night had truly included a flamingo dance-off. I could not confirm but would not deny. Minia approached again. "We're running out of lavender oil." "Let the survivors smell like survival," I told her. "It's honest." And so, with cushions reshuffled, dignity gently reattached, and the sun rising like a reluctant apology, the guests began to slip away. No grand farewells, just nods, sighs, soft shoes on stone. Aurelia stood beside me as we watched them go. "They'll forget the details," she said. "But remember the feeling," I finished. She nodded. Behind us, the parrot croaked, "Best night ever." And in its own terrible way, it was. The villa was quiet now, truly quiet. Not the theatrical hush before a performance or the ceremonial pause before dessert, but the sort of silence that swells when chaos has exhausted itself and the world remembers how to breathe. I wandered through the colonnade, stepping slowly so as not to wake the spell that clung to the marble. Pale light seeped through the oculus, painting shadows across sleeping limbs, toppled goblets and cushions bearing the imprint of laughter and sin. The scent of sandalwood still hovered, now mingled with the faint musk of humanity and the tang of spilled wine. The parrot had nestled into itself atop the fig bowl, feathers puffed, muttering softly, "More figs, praise Bacchus," then fell back into sleep. Even it had found peace. Around me lay remnants of a night too decadent for clarity. A velvet sash looped over a laurel crown, a golden comb tangled in the mane of a marble lion. One sandal, only one, balanced precariously on the rim of a jug. Minia appeared from the east hallway, a scroll in one hand, the other smoothing her wildly askew braid. "Preliminary report," she said, voice husky with exhaustion. "No fatalities, 3 definite scandals, 2 apologies already requested by messenger, 1 confirmed proposal, 1 possible engagement depending on whether the goat was symbolic." I blinked. "Goat? Let's not ask yet." She handed me the scroll. I scanned the ink-smudged notes. Someone had carved a haiku into the garden bench. "Figs fall like morals. Dawn creeps past disheveled limbs. Rome forgets its name." Surprisingly poignant, I said, more coherent than Bacchus's final verse. We entered the atrium. A servant dozed beneath a tapestry. The harpist had curled into the alcove beside his instrument, one string still vibrating in time with his snores. I spotted a note tucked into a goblet. "I regret nothing. I love the flamingo." No signature. In the triclinium, the final wines were being cleared. A single goblet remained untouched, gold-rimmed, perfectly full. I lifted it to the morning light, saw my face distorted in its surface, then placed it back untouched. Let memory have its altar. Aurelia emerged in silence. Her robe was clean, her hair loose. She looked less like a hostess than a high priestess, who had overseen a rite and seen something divine, or at least diverting. "It worked," she said. "It happened," I replied. She laughed softly. "You'll do it again." I smiled and said nothing. She didn't wait for an answer. As she disappeared into the gardens, Primus appeared beside me, holding a small leather pouch. "Left by the Carthaginian," he said. I opened it and found a coin, a dried fig, and a folded scrap of parchment. On it, "If the dream is all I recall, was it not realer than the day?" I folded it back into the pouch and placed it in the urn labeled "Questions." We kept several. The flamingos had returned to their perch, drowsy but dignified. One had a flower tucked behind its ear. I chose not to investigate further. Outside, the sun edged over the horizon. The villa exhaled. Servants began to tidy softly as if afraid to erase. I walked back to my study. There, upon the writing table, lay the original scroll from Aurelia, crisp and imperious. "Surpass Saturnalia," or else. I dipped a quill and wrote, "Beneath it, done," and then some. I sealed it with wax, placed it in the jar labeled Legend, and set it beside others. Because history isn't only written by the victors or the survivors. Sometimes it is written by the ones who swept the petals, tallied the figs, and remembered every whispered name. And as I sat, the villa slowly returning to itself, I listened one last time. Somewhere, barely audible, came the echo of laughter, a line of half-finished verse, and the rustle of drapery settling into silence, not memory, legacy,